On the morning the banns were to be read for the third time, Eleanor Whitfield walked the length of the village green in a gown the color of weak tea, and every soul in Mardley turned to watch her go to the church and bind herself to a man they all agreed she ought to fear. The frost had not yet lifted from the grass. Her breath hung white before her, and her boots, mended twice at the heel, left dark prints in the silver where she passed. She kept her chin level. She did not look at the windows, though she felt the eyes behind them as surely as she felt the cold through her thin half-boots. And she heard, because she was meant to hear it, the word the baker's wife let fall as she passed the open shop door. "Mad," the woman said, not quite under her breath. "She has gone mad, that one, or she means to be a widow rich by spring." Eleanor did not stop. She had heard worse in the 4 weeks since she had stood in the parlor of Thornfield Hall, and told its master, the Lord of Ravensmore, that yes, she would marry him, and watch something move behind his still gray eyes that she had not been able to name then, and could not name now. The village had its own name for it. The village had decided what she was the moment the agreement became known, and the village was wrong, as it was so often wrong about the things it could not be troubled to look at closely. What none of them knew, what she carried folded small and secret beneath her ribs, was the true reason she had said yes to a man the whole county called cruel. She meant to keep it there. "Stay with me, and you will learn it before the snow falls." The same as she would learn what manner of man she had truly agreed to wed. He was called the Cruel Lord because a man had died at Thornfield 2 winters past, and the Lord had not wept. Because he turned tradesmen from his door and rode out alone at hours when honest men slept, because his face when he came to church gave nothing and asked nothing, and seemed carved from the same grey stone as the manor itself. Marcus Thornfield, Lord of Ravensmore, 38 years old, with a jaw like a closed gate and eyes the color of smoke over water, had buried a wife and a brother in the space of 1 year, and had not been seen to smile since. Eleanor knew the stories. She had weighed them. She had decided, in the cold arithmetic her circumstances had taught her, that a man the world misread might be the only man who would not misread her. Her circumstances were these. Her father, the village physician, had died, in the autumn of a fever he had caught tending others, and he had left behind no fortune, only a small house mortgaged to the rafters, a shelf of medical books, and a daughter of 23 who knew more of medicine than most men licensed to practice it. He had taught her in the long evenings, let her grind the powders and read the casebooks and sit at the bedsides where a woman's presence was permitted when a woman's knowledge was not. When he died, the knowledge remained, and the permission vanished. The house would be sold. The creditors had been patient only because they were ashamed, and shame, she had learned, was a currency that ran out. There was also the matter of her sister. Grace was 12. And Grace had been born with a weakness in the chest that turned every winter into a siege. Their father had kept her alive with care and warmth, and the particular tincture he compounded from foxglove and a dozen lesser things, a recipe Eleanor knew by heart and could no longer afford to make. A cold house would kill Grace by February. Eleanor had done the arithmetic on that too, in the nights after the funeral, when she lay awake, listening to her sister's breath catch and rattle in the next room, and she had found only one column in which the numbers came out in her favor. So when word reached her that the Lord of Ravensmore had quietly let it be known he required a wife, not for love, the messenger had been careful to say, but for the running of his house and the silencing of his relations, Eleanor had put on her mended boots and walked the 2 miles to Thornfield and asked to be admitted. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pell with a face like a shut-book, had looked her over and very nearly turned her away. Something in Eleanor's steadiness had stopped her. She had been shown into a cold, bright parlor, and there she had waited, and there the Lord had come to her. He had not sat. He had stood at the window with the winter light behind him, so that she could not read his face, and he had said, in a voice low and level and entirely without warmth, that he supposed she had heard what he was I have heard what they say you are, Eleanor had answered. I have not heard it from you. There had been a silence then, longer than was comfortable, and in it she had the strange sense of being looked at properly for the first time in a long while. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed, but something in the quality of his attention had. "You are the physician's girl," he said. It was not a question. "Whitfield, he set my steward's arm 3 years ago and would take no fee." "He took no fee from anyone who could not spare it," Eleanor said. "It was a fault in him as a man of business. It was the best thing about him as a man." The Lord had turned from the window then, and she had seen his face, and she had seen that whatever else he was tired in a way that went past the body. "I will not pretend to you," he said. "I am not a kind man. I have nothing to give a wife but a name the county despises and a house that no one visits. If you marry me, you will be mistress of a tomb. Why would you choose it?" And Eleanor, who had rehearsed 100 careful answers on the walk over, had heard herself give him the only true one, or nearly the only one. "Because a tomb is warm," she said. "If there is wood for the fire. And I have a sister who will not see spring in a cold house." She had not told him the rest. She had not told him the whole of it. She had seen him hear the part she gave, and she had seen him decide something, and 3 days later, the banns had been read for the first time, and the village had begun to talk. The talk was a tide, and it did not ebb. By the second reading, it had hardened into verdict. In the dressmaker's, in the lane, at the well, the women of Mardley arranged the facts to suit the story they preferred, and the story they preferred was that Eleanor Whitfield had sold herself to a monster for a roof, and that she would regret it, and that they had always known her father's strange schooling of her would come to no good. They did not say it to her face, most of them. They said it where she could hear it, which was worse because it asked her to pretend she had not. The Lord of Ravensmoor came for her on the morning of the third reading in a black carriage that the village watched approach as though it carried the plague. He handed her up himself, which the coachman might have done, and she felt the cold leather of his glove against her bare wrist where her own glove had worn through, and she felt, to her great irritation, her pulse leap at the contact as though it had opinions she had not consulted. She arranged her face. She did not arrange her heartbeat. It went on doing as it pleased the whole short distance to the church. They were married in a cold nave with 6 people present, and the vicar reading fast against the chill. Grace sat in the front pew wrapped in every shawl they owned, and Mrs. Pell stood at the back, and 3 or 4 villagers had come to watch the way people come to watch a hanging. When the Lord took Eleanor's hand to put the ring on it, his fingers were steady, and hers were not. And he noticed, she was certain he noticed, because his thumb pressed once against her knuckles, brief and deliberate, the way one steadies a frightened horse. Then it was done. She was the Lady of Ravensmoor, mistress of a tomb, and the village had its tragedy, and only Eleanor knew that she had also, in the same hour, gotten exactly what she came for, and not at all what she had bargained on. Thornfield Hall, in the week after the wedding, was as silent as its reputation promised. It was a great cold house of grey stone, with too many rooms shut up and shrouded, and the Lord kept to his study and his fields and his long, solitary rides, and Eleanor was left to learn the geography of her new life alone. She did not mind the solitude. She had expected it. What she had not expected was the warmth, the literal warmth. Fires laid in every room she used before she woke, and Grace installed in a south-facing chamber that caught what sun the winter allowed. And a standing order, she discovered, that the child was to have whatever she needed without question. Eleanor had married for a warm house for her sister. She had not imagined the warmth would be given so completely, so without being asked twice. She set about the tincture the first day. There was a still room at Thornfield long disused, and she cleaned it herself and sent to the apothecary in the market town for what she could not find, and she compounded her father's recipe by memory and by the feel of it, and she sat with Grace through the bad nights and counted her sister's breaths growing slower and easier as the medicine and the warmth did their work. This was the thing she had come for. This was the reason. And yet as the days passed, she found the reason had grown a second room she had not built. And in that room was the question of the man she had married, who said almost nothing to her and watched her too much. And once, passing the open still-room door and seeing her bent over the mortar with her sleeves pushed up and her hair coming loose, had stopped, and stood and said nothing at all, and gone away again, with an expression she could not read. The first time he spoke to her at length was over the matter of his steward. The man Hollis had taken a chill that settled in his lungs, and the physician from the market town had bled him, and pronounced it beyond help and left him to die. Eleanor heard of it from Mrs. Sayre, Pell, who mentioned it the way one mentions weather, and Eleanor put down her sewing and went to the still room and then to the steward's cottage, at the edge of the estate, and the Lord found her there an hour later, with her hand on the dying man's chest and her ear to his breathing. "You should not be here," he said from the doorway. His voice was flat. "It may be catching." "Then you should not be here either," Eleanor said, not looking up. "And yet here you are." She felt him come into the room. She did not turn. She was listening to Hollis breathe, and what she heard was not the death the town physician had promised, but something she had heard her father describe and treat 100 times, a congestion that would drown the man only if no one troubled to keep it moving. "He is not dying," she said. "He is being allowed to. There is a difference. Have Mrs. Pell send me hot water, and the brown jar from the still-room shelf, the one marked in my hand, and a strong arm to lift him upright every hour through the night, and he will be giving you trouble again by the new year." The Lord was quiet a moment. "You are certain." "I am never certain," Eleanor said. "My father taught me that the man who is certain has stopped looking. And I have seen this before, and I have seen it mended, and I will not stand by and call it fate, because fate is easier than work." She heard how it sounded only after she had said it, the plainness of it, the refusal in it, and she braced for the cold reply a lord might give a wife who contradicted the licensed men. It did not come. What came instead was his hand on the door, and his voice giving the order to Mrs. Pell himself. The brown jar, the hot water, the arm through the night, exactly as she had said. Then he looked at Eleanor across the small, dim room, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something in his face that was not weariness and was not stone. "Stay with him as long as you judge necessary," he said, "and eat something. You have not eaten since morning. I will not have you fall ill playing physician to my servants." It was a command. It was shaped exactly like a command. Yet under it, plain to anyone who cared to hear, was the other thing. And Eleanor heard it, and looked away before her face could betray that she had Hollis lived. He was sitting up and complaining of the broth within 4 days. A great, gray-whiskered man, propped against pillows, demanding to know who had let the lower field go unplowed while he lay idle, and Eleanor sat by him each of those 4 nights, and learned the names of his grandchildren and the history of every wall on the estate, and she found she liked him, and that the liking was returned with the gruff loyalty of a man who does not forget, who refused to let him die. The story of it ran through the household and from the household to the village, where it was promptly fitted into the existing tale and made to mean nothing good. The new lady of Ravensmoor played at doctoring, they said. She gave herself airs. "A clever way," said the baker's wife, now grown bold on the subject, and holding court over her counter to any who would listen, to make herself seem worth the bargain, for everyone knew the truth of why she had married him. And the truth was money and a roof and nothing finer. A physician's daughter was no physician, the woman said, and a wife bought cheap, stayed cheap, and they would all see the proof of it before the year was out. The truth was finer, and the truth was also still hidden, and the night Hollis turned the corner, Eleanor stood at the still-room window in the dark and let herself, for one moment, feel how heavy it was to be the only one who knew the real shape of her own choosing. It was the child who first told her something of her husband's grief. Not her own sister, but the other child at Thornfield, a small, grave boy of 7 named Thomas, who Eleanor had taken some days to understand was the Lord's ward, the son of the brother who had died. He kept to the nursery wing with a tired nurse, and he did not speak above a whisper, and the household moved around him as though he were made of glass that had already cracked. Eleanor, who had a sister with a glass chest and knew exactly how a careful house could become a cage, began to visit him. She brought Grace, who was nearer his age than anyone else in that great silent place, and the 2 children took to each other the way the young will, and slowly, across afternoons of cards and read aloud stories in the nursery, Thomas began to speak in something more than a whisper. He told her, one gray afternoon with the rain on the windows, that his uncle never came to the nursery, that his uncle had loved his papa best of anyone and could not look at him, Thomas, because he had his papa's face, that his uncle was sad all the time, and that everyone said it was because he was wicked, but Thomas did not think he was wicked, only sad, and did not know how to say so to the grown people who had decided otherwise. Eleanor listened and held the cards and felt the second room inside her grow larger, and understood that she had married a house full of the same grief in different sizes, and that no one in it had been permitted to set the grief down. She found the Lord that evening in the long gallery where the family portraits hung, and where he stood as she had begun to learn he often stood before the painting of a young man who had his own dark hair and none of his stone. She did not announce herself. She watched him a moment from the doorway, the way he watched her, and she saw his hand rise toward the breast of his coat and stop, and rest there, over his heart, over something in his pocket, and she understood without being told that whatever he carried there was the center of the whole cold house. "Your nephew has your brother's face," she said quietly, and watched him go rigid. "He knows you cannot look at him. He thinks it means he has done something wrong. He is 7, and he has decided his uncle's grief is his own fault, and there is no one in this house permitted to tell him otherwise." For a long moment she thought she had gone too far. The Lord did not turn. When he spoke, his voice was very low and not entirely steady. "You presume a great deal," he said, "about things you cannot know." "I know what it is to watch a child decide they are a burden," Eleanor said. "I have one of my own. I married you to keep her warm. I will not stand silent while another child freezes in a warm house for want of being told he is loved." She had not meant to say so much. She had not meant to say any of it. Now it was out, and she stood in it, and waited. The Lord turned, and the thing he had been holding back since the cold parlor where they had met, the thing she had seen move behind his eyes and could not name, came forward now into his face. And it was not cruelty, and it had never been cruelty. It was grief worn so long it had calcified into the shape the village mistook for stone. "I held my brother while he died," he said, "and my wife the winter before. I was certain both times that I could mend it by force of will, that if I only refused to let them go, they would stay. I was wrong both times, and I have not trusted my own judgment of anything since. I cannot look at the boy, because when I look at him I see every hour I failed his father." He stopped. His hand was still at his breast. "There. Now you know what you married. A man who could not save the 2 people he loved best in the world." Eleanor crossed the gallery to him. She did not touch him, though she wanted to, though her whole body leaned toward him as a plant leans toward a window. She stomped a careful foot away and looked up into his ruined, steady face and said, "The true thing. You did not fail them. You loved them, and they died anyway, which is the oldest grief there is, and the one no force of will has ever mended. My father knew that. It is why he took no fees. He could not stop death, so he gave what he could to the living freely, and called it enough." She paused. "Look at the boy. Marcus. He is the living. He is what you can still reach." It was the first time she had used his name. She saw it land. She saw him take it, like a man taking a hand he had not known was offered. And for one suspended moment in the cold gallery, the whole distance between them thinned to almost nothing. His gaze dropped once to her mouth, and rose again. Her own breath had gone shallow and loud in her own ears, and she was aware, with a clarity that frightened her, of exactly where he stood, and exactly how the candlelight caught the gray at his temple, and exactly how warm he was in all that cold stone, and her hand had risen of its own accord halfway to his chest before she knew it had moved. She stopped it. She let it fall. The space between his fingers and her face was the width of a held decision, and neither of them was breathing properly, and somewhere below them a clock she had never noticed before was suddenly very loud. "Eleanor," he said, low. It was the first time he had used her name as well, and the sound of it in his level voice did something to the floor of her that she had no word for and did not try to find. He did not close the distance. She did not close it. They stood at the edge of the thing and neither stepped over. And that not stepping was louder than any word. And when he finally drew back, it was with the air of a man who has discovered the ground is closer than he feared, and has decided he is not yet ready to fall. After that, the house began very slowly to thaw. He went to the nursery. Eleanor did not witness the first visit, but she saw its aftermath in Thomas, who began to speak above a whisper, and to leave the nursery wing, and to appear at meals where his uncle sat at the head of the table, and for the first time anyone could recall, asked the child a question, and waited for the answer. Mrs. Pell, who had served the family through both deaths and had a face like a shut book, unbent so far one morning as to tell Eleanor while polishing a candlestick that did not need polishing, that she had not heard a child's footstep running in the upper hall in 3 years, and that she had thought she never would again. And then she had pressed her lips together and said no more, which from Mrs. Pell was a speech of great length and greater feeling. The shrouds came off 2 of the shut rooms. A girl was hired up from the village to help with the increase in fires. The great cold house, room by room, remembered it had once been lived in. The Lord and Eleanor took to walking the estate grounds in the late afternoons at the proper social distance, with the gardeners visible at their work, and they talked of medicine and of his brother and of her father, and the talking became the hour she found herself living toward all day. He showed her the lower field Hollis had fretted over, and the old orchard his brother had planted, and the rise from which the whole estate could be seen gray and gold under the low winter sun. And she told him of her father's case-books, and the patients he had mended, and the ones he had not, and they discovered that grief shared at the proper social distance is lighter than grief carried alone. He commanded her, "Still, sit down. You are tired. Come in from the cold. Eat the better portion." And she heard now, every time, the tenderness folded inside the order like a letter inside a plain envelope, and she stopped, pretending, at least to herself, that her heart had no opinions. She had not yet told him the rest of her reason. The whole of it, she had begun to want to. The trouble, when it came from the direction. Trouble always came from at Thornfield, which was the dowager. The Lord's aunt, the Dowager Lady Ravensmore, kept a house in the market town, and a grip on the family's consequence that she had no intention of loosening, and she had not approved the marriage, and she had been waiting, with the patience of a woman who has never once doubted she is right for her moment. It came at the assembly, the great winter assembly, in the town's old rooms, the first public occasion to which the new lady of Ravensmore was bidden, and the dowager arranged it with care. She had brought a girl, Miss Sophronia Carlyle, the daughter of a baronet, 18 and lovely, and dressed in ice-blue silk that cost more than Eleanor's father had earned in a year. The match the dowager had intended for her nephew before the physician's girl had spoiled it. The dowager arranged the girl at her side, and arranged her own face into welcome, and waited for Eleanor to arrive in whatever poor thing she owned, and Eleanor arrived in her mother's made-over gown, cream gone faintly gold with age, and the room turned to look, and the dowager smiled. "My dear," the dowager said, loud enough for the nearest dozen to hear, taking Eleanor's hand in both of hers with a warmth that was itself a weapon. "How brave of you to come, and how clever you have been. We all so admire a girl who knows how to better herself. Tell me, was it the house you wanted, or only to be warm? One does understand. A physician's daughter, with debts, and that consumptive little sister to think of. One does understand entirely." She turned to the ice blue girl. "Sophronia, here is the lady who married my nephew. Is she not just as we imagined? Quite the little nurse." The room heard it. The room arranged its face to match the dowager's. Eleanor felt the old, cold close over her. The village verdict, given new clothes and a grander room, the dismissal she had carried since her father died, now spoken by a woman whose word could make it law in 3 counties. She felt her sister's name used as a blade. She felt her pulse going hard in her throat, and she felt, worst of all, her composure beginning to crack, the heat rising in her face that would be red as shame. And across the room she saw the Lord turn from his conversation and go very still. What the dowager did next, she did because she believed, as she had always believed, that she was simply stating the order of things. She had a paper. She had brought a solicitor's letter, and she produced it now in the warm public crush, and she explained sweetly that there was an old provision in the family settlement, a question of whether the Lord's marriage to a woman of no fortune and no family might be set aside as a thing done in unsound grief, and that she had taken advice, and that the advice was promising, and that dear Sophronia remained, of course, entirely free. She held the letter out, as one holds out a gift. She had crossed, at last, the line she had been walking toward all evening, and she did it smiling. Certain the law, and the room and the order of things were all on her side. This was the dark moment, and Eleanor stood in the center of it and understood that everything she had built in 6 weeks, the warmth, the tincture, the thawing house, the second room in her heart, could be unmade by a paper and a smiling old woman, and that the village had been right after all in the only way that mattered, which was that she had no standing here, no name, no shield. She thought of Grace in the south-facing room. She thought of the cold house waiting. And then she did the thing her father had taught her, which was to stop being certain and start looking. And what she saw when she looked was the Lord crossing the room. He did not hurry. The Lord of Ravensmoor crossed the assembly rooms at the unhurried pace of a man who has stopped being afraid of his own judgment, and the crowd parted for him, and the dowager's smile held for 3 steps and began to falter on the 4th, and he came to stand beside Eleanor, not in front of her as a shield, but beside her as an equal. And he looked at the letter in his aunt's hand, and then at his aunt's face, and the room went entirely silent. "Aunt," he said, and his voice carried without rising, level and gray and final, "Put it away." The dowager's hand did not move. "Marcus, you do not understand what you have done. The settlement is clear. A marriage made in grief to a woman who cannot bring a single thing of value to this family. You must see it. I have never in my life been more clear-headed than the day I married her." He took the letter from his aunt's fingers, not roughly, and folded it once, and held it. Then he turned to face the room, the whole watching room, the baronets and their wives, and the girl in ice blue, and the witnesses who had come to see the physician's daughter put in her place. His hand went to his breast, to the pocket. And this time, it did not stop. He drew out the thing he carried there, and Eleanor saw it at last, a small worn miniature in a tarnished frame, a portrait of a dark-haired young man, his brother, carried over his heart through every cold day she had known him. He held it a moment in his open palm where the nearest could see it. "I carried my brother here for 2 years," he said, "because I believed I had failed him, and a man who has failed cannot be trusted to choose. I believed that until a physician's daughter walked into my dead house and began, without permission, to bring it back to life. She saved my steward when your licensed man left him to drown in his own bed. She gave my brother's son back his voice. She asked nothing for herself, and took nothing she did not earn." He looked at Eleanor, then only at her, and the room and the dowager and the ice blue girl fell away from his attention entirely. "This is my wife," he said. I would marry her again tomorrow. 12 words. And they fell into the silence the way a stone falls into a still pond, and the silence held after them wide and complete. The dowager's face, which had never in living memory been seen to lose its composure, came apart in small stages. The smile first, then the certainty behind it, then the thing under the certainty, which was simply an old woman who had been wrong and had said so in front of 3 counties. Sophronia Carlyle, who was 18 and not unkind, looked at the Lord looking at his wife, and understood, quite suddenly, and to her credit completely, that she had been brought here as a weapon, and that the weapon had not fired, and she stepped back from the dowager's side, with the smallest possible curtsy, and removed herself from the field. The Lord's solicitor, a dry man named Pettigrew, who had been standing unnoticed at the edge of the room the whole evening, came forward now into the quiet and said, in the flat voice of a man for whom the law held no romance, that he had reviewed the settlement at his lordship's request some weeks past, that the provision the dowager cited had lapsed in the previous generation, and that the marriage was sound in every particular and beyond any challenge. He had been there all evening. Eleanor had not seen him. The Lord, she understood now, had seen the whole of it coming, and had quietly armed himself against it, because a man who has learned to stop being certain has also learned to prepare. It was over very quickly after that. As these things are, the dowager gathered the shreds of her consequence and withdrew. The room which had come to watch a woman humbled found it had watched something else entirely, and the room in the way of rooms adjusted itself to the new order, with quiet speed, and several of the women who had been loudest in the village found occasion, before the evening ended, to tell Eleanor how very fond they had always been of her late father. She received them gravely, and gave them nothing to repeat. She had no wish to triumph. She had only ever wished to be seen, and she had been seen now in the brightest room in 3 counties, by the one person whose seeing had come to matter more than all the rest. In the carriage home, she told him the rest of it at last, the whole of her reason. She had not married him only for the warm house, though that had been true and was reason enough. She had married him because, in the cold parlor where they met, when he had said he was not a kind man and offered her a tomb, she had seen the way his eyes had gone to the window when he spoke of having nothing to give, and she had recognized the look because she had worn it herself in the months after her father died, and she had thought, with a certainty she had not examined until this moment, that here was a person as alone as she was, and that perhaps 2 people each convinced they had nothing left to give might, between them, turn out to have a great deal. She had married him on a guess. She had guessed that the cruel Lord was a grieving one. She had been right, and being right had cost her every certainty she owned, and she would not trade it back for anything the world could offer. He listened to all of it in the dark of the swaying carriage, and when she had finished, he did the thing he had not done in the gallery. He lifted his gloved hand and laid it against her cold cheek, and turned her face to his, and kissed her. Once softly, with the whole of a held promise in it, the only kiss either of them would speak of afterward, and chaste as it was, it undid them both more thoroughly than anything bolder could have done. The snow came in earnest the following week, and it was on the first white evening that Eleanor sat in the warm gallery at Thornfield, with the fire built high, and her sister and the boy Thomas playing at spillikins on the hearthrug, both of them breathing easy, both of them warm. And she watched her husband come into the room and stand a moment in the doorway, as he had stood in so many doorways watching her, except that now he was smiling. The smile the village had sworn for 2 years, he no longer possessed. On the small table beside her chair lay the miniature of his brother. He had taken it from his pocket at last, on the night of the assembly, and he had not put it back, and Eleanor had found a place for it here in the warm gallery where the boy could see his father's face in the firelight whenever he wished, which was the place such a thing belonged, out where the living were, and not hidden over a closed heart. The Lord crossed the room and sat beside her, and they did not speak, because the children were laughing and the fire was loud, and there was nothing that needed saying. Snow fell past the tall windows. The portrait of the dark-haired young man caught the firelight, and seemed almost to be glad. And Eleanor Thornfield, who had walked the village green 6 weeks before, in a gown the color of weak tea, while a whole town named her mad, sat warm in a house no longer a tomb, beside a man no longer cruel, and understood that she had not bettered herself at all in the way the dowager meant. She had only at last come home. Thank you for staying to the end of her story. If Eleanor's quiet courage moved you, leave a word below with the moment that stayed with you, and stay warm wherever you are.